Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be looking closely at The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. More specifically, we're going to try to understand Esther Greenwood and what factors contribute to her breakdown.
Okay.
Our main source material for this is going to be excerpts from the book itself.
Sounds good. It's a powerful book.
Oh, yeah.
Plath really pulls you into Esther's mind and how she's thinking and feeling.
Right. And you get this sense of unease right away from the start. You know, she's in New York City for this glamorous summer internship.
Right.
But instead of being, excited about it, she feels really alienated and detached.
Yeah. Yeah.
It makes you wonder, like, what is going on beneath the surface?
Right, exactly. What's causing this disconnect? And one thing that's so interesting is how Plath uses symbolism to convey Esther's state of mind. Like, for instance, the image of the expensive clothes hanging limp as fish in her closet.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just fashion. It's about her inability to connect with, the things that are supposed to bring her joy. She's going through the motions, but she's just feeling really empty inside.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And it's not just the clothes, right? It's also the shoes she buys are uncomfortable. She forces a smile for a magazine photo shoot. It all points to this growing dissonance between what society expects of her
Yeah.
and how she's actually feeling. It's like she's trying to fit into this mold
Exactly.
that doesn't suit her.
And then on top of all of that, there's this unsettling backdrop of the Rosenberg execution, which deeply disturbs her.
Yeah?
It seems to heighten her awareness of mortality and suffering, even though it's happening outside of her immediate world.
Yeah, and I always found this part so powerful because it reveals Esther's sensitivity and her tendency to internalize the pain and injustices of the world.
Right.
And it kind of foreshadows her own descent into mental anguish.
Right. She's absorbing all the negativity around her, and it's starting to weigh her down.
Exactly. And so Plath also introduces these contrasting female figures that represent different paths for Esther.
All right.
So we have Doreen. She is the rebellious and cynical one. She has this perpetual sneer, and she kind of embodies this jaded worldliness.
Right.
And then you have Betsy, who's kind of the sweet, innocent one who represents this traditional femininity.
Right.
And Esther seems drawn to both of them, but also feels conflicted by their opposing values.
Exactly. She's trying to figure out where she fits in the spectrum of womanhood, navigating the complexities of what it means to be a woman.
Yes.
In a society that often pushes women into very narrow roles.
Right. And this is something that so many people can relate to, I think even today.
Yeah.
The pressure to conform.
Yeah.
To fit into a certain mold, whether it's based on gender or societal expectations or even our own internalized beliefs. It can be really suffocating.
Absolutely. And then there's Buddy Willard.
Oh, yeah.
The medical student that Esther initially kind of puts on a pedestal.
Oh, yeah. She idealizes him.
Yeah. But as we get to know him, we see all these flaws and hypocrisy.
Right. And the weekend that she spends with Buddy at his medical school feels like a turning point to me, Witnessing the birth scene seems to really traumatize her.
Yeah.
And then the whole thing with the waitress comes out.
Right. Exactly. What do you think this betrayal reveals about Esther's worldview, and how do you think it might have impacted her mental state?
Well, I think on one hand, it just totally shatters this idealized image she has of Buddy. It forces her to confront the reality that, someone she admires can be flawed.
Right.
Capable of hurting her.
And it exposes this huge double standard around sexuality.
Yeah.
Particularly for women in that time period in the 1950s.
Absolutely.
Remember how Buddy preaches about purity?
Oh, yeah.
But then he's engaging in this hypocritical affair. And
Yeah.
this seems to really fuel Esther's own anxieties about sex and purity.
Exactly.
Which becomes a huge theme throughout the novel.
Yeah, and we see how she really fixates on virginity.
Yeah.
And dividing the world into those who've crossed the line and those who haven't. It's like she's clinging to this idea of purity as a way to define herself.
Right.
And maintain some sense of control in a world that feels increasingly chaotic.
Right. Which is interesting because even as she obsesses over this purity, she also feels this pull towards experience, towards breaking free from societal constraints,
Totally.
And we see this play out in her relationship with Constantin, the simultaneous interpreter that she meets.
Right.
She decides to sleep with him, but then the experience isn't what she expected it to be.
Right.
And then shortly after that, she gets this painful leg infection.
Yeah.
Almost as if it's like a punishment for defying societal norms.
Yeah. Yeah.
you know?
Well, Plath really uses that detail effectively.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
almost like a physical manifestation of the shame and guilt that she's grappling with internally.
Absolutely. It adds another layer to her already complex emotional state.
Right. So we have all of these internal struggles that are brewing,
Yeah.
feeling trapped, questioning her identity, battling these societal expectations. And then on top of that, she's dealing with these complicated relationships that are leaving her feeling disillusioned and betrayed.
Exactly. And it does seem like the foundation of her life is starting to crumble. So where does she go from here?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
And I think in order to understand that, we need to delve into the next part of the novel where we really see Esther's mental state start to deteriorate even further.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
All right.
As we move into the next part of the book, things really do take a darker turn for Esther.
Yeah.
Her internal world, is already kind of shaky,
Right.
but it really starts to unravel completely.
Yeah, it's like all those cracks we were talking about before. Those anxieties and disappointments that become full-blown fault lines.
Exactly. And what's so captivating is that Plath doesn't shy away from portraying, the real intensity of a mental breakdown.
Right.
It's not sugar-coated or anything.
Yeah.
It's raw. It's visceral.
It's terrifying, especially the scenes where Esther attempts suicide.
Right.
When she tries to hang herself in the attic and then tries to drown herself in the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
Those are so hard to read, but also so powerful because of how honestly they portray the desperation of someone struggling with mental illness.
Right. And it's important to note that, these aren't just impulsive acts. These are calculated and planned. She's actively seeking a way out of her pain.
Yeah.
And she's willing to go to extreme lengths to find it.
Right. It makes you wonder what pushes someone to that point.
Yeah.
What happens when the pain becomes so bad that death seems like the only option?
Right. Those are the tough questions Plath is forcing us to think about.
Yeah.
And then the novel explores the complexities of treatment.
Right.
And the two hospitals that she goes to.
Yeah. The private one with Dr. Gordon and then the state-run asylum.
Yeah. They really highlight these vast differences in how we approach mental health care.
Yeah. And that contrast is striking. The private hospital, with its prestige and exclusivity, it ends up being this cold and sterile environment that makes Esther feel even more isolated.
Right. And Dr. Gordon himself is very distant. He's this analytical figure who seems more interested in dissecting her psyche than actually connecting with her as a human being.
Right.
He almost represents, those societal forces that are contributing to her breakdown in the first place.
Yeah.
Like the pressure to conform, the judgment, the lack of empathy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the state-run asylum, which you would think would be more institutionalized and impersonal,
Right.
actually ends up giving Esther a sense of structure and community that she really needs.
It's interesting how that works out.
Yeah, it's one of those paradoxes.
Right.
The place that's supposed to confine and control her actually offers a strange kind of refuge.
Right. And it's within the walls of that asylum that she finds some kind of stability, even if it's in the context of a mental health institution.
Right. And it's there that she meets Dr. Nolan, the female psychiatrist, who finally seems to see her and understand her struggles without judging her.
Right. Dr. Nolan is such an important character because she really represents this glimmer of hope in this otherwise bleak landscape for Esther.
Yeah.
She listens, she empathizes, and she treats Esther with dignity and respect. And it's through that connection with Dr. Nolan that Esther starts to see that it might be possible for her to heal.
Right. But it's still not an easy journey. Even with Dr. Nolan's support, Esther still has to work through all of this trauma. And then there's the whole experience with shock therapy.
Right. That was a really common treatment for mental illness at the time.
Right.
But for Esther, it feels like a huge violation.
Yeah.
A betrayal.
Yeah. It raises this question of, what is the price of sanity?
Yeah.
Is it worth sacrificing your individuality and your unique perspective to conform to some idea of well-being?
Exactly. And that's something I think a lot of people struggle with even today. We're often pressured to fit in, to mask our true selves. But at what cost?
It's like that image of the fig tree, with the figs representing all of Esther's lost opportunities.
Right.
The choices that seem to disappear as she has to face her mental illness.
And it's not just about, career paths or anything.
Right.
It's about agency.
Right.
The ability to shape your own life. The fig tree is so powerful because it speaks to that fear we all have of losing control.
Right.
Of being trapped.
Totally. And yet, amidst all this despair, we see glimpses of Esther's resilience. This determination to find her own way.
Right.
Like her fantasy of becoming a war correspondent like Maggie Higgins.
Exactly. That's a great example. It shows us that even with everything she's going through, there's still this spark inside her.
Yeah.
This desire to break free and do things her own way.
Right. It's like that dream represents a different version of herself.
Right.
One that's bolder and more adventurous.
Right.
Uninhibited.
But it also highlights the limitations placed on women during that time. What stands out to you the most about those contrasting desires? You know, to be a wife and a mother versus a world-traveling journalist.
Well, it's so clear that Esther feels this conflict between what society wants her to be and what she actually wants for herself. The traditional path of, getting married and having kids just feels so suffocating.
Yeah.
And being a war correspondent represents freedom and agency. But it also makes me think about how those pressures haven't entirely disappeared.
Oh, absolutely not.
Women today still struggle with, pursuing certain careers, balancing their personal and professional lives. It's a different world, but some of those struggles are the same.
And it's interesting how Plath uses Esther's intelligence and her talent as both a gift and a burden.
Right.
She excels academically, she's getting published, but it almost seems like her brilliance makes her even more sensitive to the phoniness of the world around her.
Right? It's like she can't just accept things at face value.
Yeah.
She sees right through everything. And that awareness, that inability to conform, just makes her feel alienated and even more despairing.
Exactly.
Makes me think about how sometimes being too aware can be painful.
Yeah.
Especially when you're surrounded by people who don't see things the same way.
Right. And so that brings us to the end of the novel, which is both hopeful and ambiguous at the same time.
Right.
Esther gets released from the asylum and she seems cured, but you have to wonder,
Right.
Is she really going to be okay? What's waiting for her out there?
What challenges are ahead? And that final encounter with Buddy is so telling.
Yes.
He asks her who she's going to marry now that she's been here.
Right.
As if this experience at the asylum is something she can just bounce back from.
Yeah, he just doesn't get it.
Right. It shows how little he really understands what she's been through and how she's changed.
Yeah.
It's almost as if he expects her to just slip back into that role, that box society has created for her. But I think it's clear that Esther's changed. This experience has really altered her.
Yeah, and her response, or lack thereof, is very telling. She doesn't know who she'll marry, and that's exactly the point. She's stepping into an uncertain future, but it's no longer defined by those societal expectations. It's going to be defined by her own evolving sense of self.
Right. It's an ending that kind of stays with you. You're left with this sense of both hope and uncertainty. It really reflects how complex mental illness and recovery are.
Yeah, it's definitely a reminder that healing isn't linear.
Right.
There will be setbacks, there will be challenges, moments of doubt, but there's also the potential for real growth and transformation, for finding a new strength.
And I think that's one of the reasons why the Bell Jar continues to be so powerful for so many readers, even decades after it was published.
Yeah.
It speaks to these universal experiences of feeling alienated and trapped by expectations and just struggling to find your place.
Absolutely. And even though it's set in the 1950s, these themes are so relevant today.
Right.
Think about the constant pressure to achieve the comparison to others, the pursuit of perfection that we see so much of on social media.
Oh, yeah. It can be really overwhelming.
And it can be so isolating.
Right.
Like Esther, you can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone in what you're going through.
Totally. And the novel also reminds us that we're not alone in these experiences.
Yeah.
So many people are going through the same things, even if they don't show it.
Exactly. And I think that's where literature, the power of stories like this comes in. It lets us connect with these characters. We see ourselves in their struggles, and it helps us realize that it's okay to not be okay.
Right.
It's okay to ask for help, to need support, to admit when we're struggling.
Yeah, and sometimes even just sharing our stories or listening to others' stories can be so healing.
Right.
It can really break down those walls of isolation and remind us that we're all in this together.
This raises a really interesting question about the novel itself. The Bell Jar is considered by many to be semi-autobiographical. Have you ever thought about how Sylvia Plath's own life might inform your reading of the book and of Esther's journey? I think it's worth looking into.
Yeah, it definitely adds another layer to the whole experience. Knowing that Plath struggled with mental illness herself.
Yeah.
And that she tragically, took her own life not long after the book was published.
Yeah.
It gives the novel this weight. this haunting reality to it.
And it makes you appreciate the honesty of her writing even more.
Hmm.
You know, she really wasn't afraid to go to those dark places.
Right.
And explore those difficult emotions, the pain and the beauty, the despair and the resilience.
Right. Well, I think we've covered a lot today. We went deep into Esther's breakdown and looked at those societal pressures that made things so hard for her, and saw how resilient she was in the face of so much adversity. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And if there's just one thing I hope you take away from this deep dive with us today, it's this. Even when we feel trapped, even when it feels like we're drowning, there's always hope. There's always the possibility of healing and growing and finding our way back to the light.
And remember, you are not alone in this. Reach out, connect, share your story. You might be surprised by the support you find. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the bell jar. We'll see you next time.